Welcome back, everyone, to Afrodo Reviews. Now, on this channel, I help you decide. Is that book worth reading over second breakfast? Or does it deserve the fiery pits of Mount Doom? That's what we're here to decide. So today's book is Babysitter of the Apocalypse, which is a Kindle book published on November 27th of 2023 by author Courtney Constantin. I believe it's Constantin because it doesn't have an E at the end, so as much as I want to call her Courtney Constantine. This is technically the first full book in this series, though the story was preceded by a short story of the same name. Actually, very technically speaking, it's called a prequel called The Babysitter of the Apocalypse. While this book is technically Babysitter of the Apocalypse, We Don't Sacrifice Kids to Zombies. However, I feel first of all, using the full title for this book feels a little mouthful. You know what I mean? Two, I'm going to kind of review both in this, so Babysitter of the Apocalypse just fits pretty well. And three, calling the first short story a prequel is being very generous to it, I believe. I'll get into why later, but apart from that, I can't find too much worth sharing here that's interesting on the background of this book. So, yeah, here's the report card. And now we move on to the cover. Now, the cover of this book is okay. I'm not going to sing any praises home about it, as both versions I've seen are just a Photoshop stand-in for our main character on the front with the destroyed city tinted in orange in the background. Considering these are self-published novels on Amazon, I'm not really going to disparage it either. It fits the book, it sets the setting, and it tells you what it's about. It doesn't really need to do too much else. So it's not like it's ill-fitting. It's just one of those ones that if there was a full publishing company behind it, I'd get mad about. But it's an independent author. It's fine. So let's go ahead and move on. Now, the synopsis of this book. Since originally this was more of a minor TBR before I more or less got sucked into it, I didn't necessarily make a first reaction to it. But honestly, that's probably for the better. I really haven't gotten any feedback at all about how I'm trying to do the TBRs from now on. So from now on, I'm just gonna do the thing I used to do when I didn't get a TBR out, and I'm just gonna talk about the book inside the review. In the synopsis section, I'll read the back and I'll add anything onto the synopsis that I feel is missing. On Amazon, the synopsis of the book, at least for this We Don't Sacrifice Kids to Zombies section, is: in a world overrun by the undead, with no experience in parenthood and an empty past that haunts her every step, Vicky is the last person you'd expect to be a caregiver. A borderline alcoholic struggling to keep her own demons at bay, she's suddenly thrust into the role of a protector for two young children. But just as they think they can take a breath and relax, tragedy strikes, leaving Vicky and the kids alone with a mysterious newcomer. Desperate for safety and a sense of belonging, they join forces, forming a fragile survivor group. As the days turn into weeks and the bond between Vicky and the children deepens, she discovers that she may need them as much as they need her. Together, they navigate a world where the line between life and death is blurred, finding hope and humanity in the most unexpected places. Yet, the zombies are not their only threat. So while the synopsis is a little vague, I do think it offers just enough to make you curious without mostly outright spoiling the scenes in the first book. I do think there is one sort of big spoiler in the synopsis, but really it's not that big of one. So it's hard to hold it much against the description on Amazon. In any case, for the most part, the only thing I think I would clarify for the sake of this review, so you have context for what I'm going to be talking about, is that the mysterious stranger is a man named Theo. Now, as it stands in this book, describing him as a mysterious stranger and nothing else gives a sense that he'll be an enigmatic character that we won't really understand for most of the book, and that a good portion of the book will be dealing with him and trying to figure out what he's all about. But I don't really feel like I'm spoiling when I say he's not that. The twist behind his character is that he's being chased by a cult named the Children of Z, which are like the Children of Lazarus from the Rotten Runes series, But unlike the Children of Lazarus, the Children of Z are the more stereotypical version, where they're very evil and they're trying to kill people. Theo is being chased by these cultists because he did something to anger them. But at the same time, his help is so vital to raising the girls that Vicky is willing to brave that danger in order to better take care of the girls. He's not really mysterious. He's very much open with who he is and what his problems are. So I don't really think that was a fair way to describe him in the synopsis. It sets him up way too much for something he doesn't really deliver on. But in any case, before I get too deep into it, the real question comes down to, is this a good book? I mean, yeah, of course. When it comes to Kindle published works, especially ones with quirky names, it's always a crapshoot on whether or not it's going to be a great book or it's going to rely very heavily on its superficial charm to tell a rather generic story. The book falls much further into the good side of the debate, though that I wouldn't say I didn't find this without some serious flaws. But that's for later. For now, I will say that I genuinely enjoyed the relationship that Constantine wrote between Vicky and the two girls, who have been unwillingly thrust into her arms. Neither of them are really happy with this arrangement, at least not Vicky and Gabby, who's the older of the two, because Tina, who's the youngest, is more of a toddler. She doesn't kind of understand what's going on yet. You definitely get the sense that the relationship is slowly evolving as time goes on without it being in your face. And there's definitely gut punch moments that made me genuinely sad for these characters. The scene with Vicky and Gabby are on the swing set genuinely broke my heart. And it was a very nice showcase of how close they were getting as a found family. I also do like that the book addresses some... Okay. How to word this? I do like that the book sort of addresses some of the more survival things that is overlooked in other works of zombie apocalypses. In a lot of zombie works, at least the ones I've read, the essentials that get focused on are typically food, water, and medicine, which are very important. But in this book, we actually see them going out to get gas, we see them trying to find new clothes, setting up laundry and bathing stations, we see them getting toys for the kids to keep them busy and stimulated, needing to construct play areas to keep the toddler safe, things like that. Constantine actually makes you feel, to at least a degree, that the struggles Theo and Vicky have are more than just feeding and making sure these kids are watered to keep them safe from the world of the undead and help them grow. I also admit that one of the characters they meet a little bit halfway through the book, named Bets, is one of my favorite characters, although I guess I'm a bit weak to the kooky character. I personally just found her a joy to read because she adds both levity and badassery to the scene. Whereas Theo and Vicky are very much... they're kind of bland characters at a certain point, whereas Bets adds a very decent, sense of liveliness to the story. Okay, so I guess I'm avoiding it at this point, but my biggest complaint about this book, and I think a large reason I didn't like the book as well as I did, is admittedly Theo. Now, don't get me wrong, I like Theo as a character. There's nothing about his direct character that I'll sit here and be like, I fucking hate this guy, if you ask me about him. What I hated about Theo was more about what he does to our main character, Vicky. You see, in the prequel and the first part of this book, Vicky is an interesting character. She was an apathetic drunk who suddenly found herself responsible for 2 young lives, and knows she has to save them from the dangers of the zombie-infested world, but at the same time, she's a mess of a person. She can barely take care of herself.
Toast, damn you!
No!
Toast!
Easy Pete's with you people.
We see that she's woefully underprepared to be a parent, and she's consciously trying to get to a point where she can give these kids a better home. But she also kind of wants to get them to a point where she can sit in the background and let these kids get a better life. However, circumstances keep forcing her into the active protagonist role, thus forcing her to bond with the kids and making her more and more reluctant to actually pass them off to someone who she thinks is better prepared. At first, it's because she's the only adult. That's mostly what's going on in the prequel. And then in the story itself, the first part of the story, it's because she's the only one who has the chops for making it in the harder scenarios of the world. It's a nice, interesting read to see her struggling between trying to take care of the girls and being the only member of her group capable of handling with the zombies and scavenging both physically and mentally. And then Theo's introduced. The moment Theo's introduced, Vicky just slides right in to be a passive protagonist. She sits back, lets Theo tell her what to do, how to do it, and relies on him for pretty much everything in regards to both the emotional and the physical aspects of things. And while Vicky clearly was a reluctant active protagonist in the early parts of the book, the fact of the matter is she was still an active protagonist. She was still doing things to help advance the plot. We see her struggling with her new role as caretaker. We see her making mistakes and learning from them, but then Theo comes along and ruins that. Every time, while Theo's in the picture, everything is fine. He always has the answer, the relevant knowledge or experience, and is always the one pushing Vicky to be a better person. When the plot occurs, it's there for Theo, not for Vicky. Vicky becomes a secondary character in her own story. She doesn't do anything to push the narrative forward. I call her a passive protagonist, but honestly, I'm being a little generous when I say that, because protagonist implies that she's the driving force of the narrative, and she's not. Theo should have just been the protagonist at this rate, and the story told in third person. And that sort of makes this story boring after a certain point. I mean, I did compliment the fact that Constantine makes us feel the various nuances that comes with survival beyond food, water, and medicine. But at the same time, it's not hard to imagine how others might find this annoying, and you can definitely look at it and see, okay, so this is a puddle. It's wider, but it's not necessarily deeper. Because at a certain point, Theo and Vicky do seem to just kind of find what they want with little to no problems. For example, Theo needs a specific tool to remove seats from a private jet in order to make it a more livable space. You think something like that would be a specialized tool, maybe something they'd have to get closer to the swarming airport that's just swamped with zombies to try and find one to make their lives more comfortable, or would they just brave it and be uncomfortable for the sake of safety? And even if that's not true, you could add that in to make it seem true, to add some flavor to the story. But no, they just go to a nearby hardware store, Theo finds it, takes them out. And again, that's probably true to form, but that makes this whole moment where they're talking about the need for this tool and the struggle to get it just feel pointless. And I'm going to be completely fair to Theo. This isn't a problem that he himself introduced. For example, the zombies. And to be completely fair to Theo, this is not a unique problem that is beholden only to him and his presence. For example, the zombies. At a certain point, the zombie encounters just felt like they were occurring to remind you every so often, this is in fact a zombie book. They didn't feel like a consistent threat, or even a threat, like a threat that became a part of nature, something they have to live with from now on. Say what you will about works like Rotten Rune, or even, admittedly, The End of Us. It never quite got to the point where it feels like we're just having random encounters with zombies, just to remind us that this is in fact a zombie work. Another issue that I had with this comes from the Children of Z. Namely, they kind of come off like a bullshit villain. They kind of always know when to show up to make our characters' lives hell, where to show up to do it even if they have no reason to suspect that our characters are there, or this is quite a distance away from where they were last seen. And they always seem to know when to get the drop on our characters and how. Our characters do manage to cross entire states in this book, and somehow the Children of Z always seem to find them again. While I could excuse the time at the airport as sort of a quirk of fate, them arriving, their encounter with Bets, leading them to Theo, recognizing him and radioing back, the other encounters, not so much. It always feels like the author has them just out of sight around the corner, so she can pull them back in with no explanation. Because, and unfortunately, that doesn't really lend to a formidable villain. It leads into a villain that you're like, seriously, they're back? If you'd ask me, this book feels more like it'd be at home in an EMP world than a zombie world. For as much emphasis that's been placed on supplies and travel dangers, people do it in this world very easily and casually, and can do it for long distances. Part of the reason the Children of Z bothers me is because they're crossing entire states with Theo and Vicky. So either they have a massive network only a couple months into the apocalypse, or they're so powerful they can just cross states at a whim after somebody.
How did we, Kronk?
Well, you got me. By all accounts, it doesn't make sense.
It feels like when they make these travels, there's no danger in the travel itself, but rather what happens only when they run into other people or have to stop for supplies. Even though the zombies aren't quite so easily dealt with as you'd see in some other zombie works, and at least by the end of this book, that makes them feel, it does make them feel completely pointless. It doesn't feel like they're a consistent threat. It does get to the point where you think she forgot she was writing a zombie book at times. Again, which is why it comes to the point where at a certain point it starts to feel like zombies start popping up, just to remind you, zombie book. I mean, you can definitely feel the passion about her writing in this apocalypse. It's just, it feels like the zombie part was tacked on a little later. Maybe her Sundown series is more of her main series, though, to be fair. Maybe The Babysitter, The Apocalypse, and Sundown are set in the same universe, and this is more of a offshoot of the series that she's more interested in writing. It'd make a certain amount of sense, and it would explain why things felt so rushed at times, like why nothing really just stops and like explains itself. I read a book like this in the past called Slip Runner, and I picked it up because it had an amazing cover art, and I was like, oh, this seems fun. And I was reading it, and while it seemed like there was a world there that was fully realized, the narrative was talking to me like I should already know how this world exists, already know the rules of this world, already know the history of this world. The problem is I didn't until I looked it up and found out, oh, so this is a spin-off of another series called Backyard Starship. That explains a lot. Unfortunately, nothing on Amazon told me that. And this problem doesn't just extend to this novel. It's sort of a problem with the prequel novella, too. At a point, it sort of felt like this was meant to be a side story and perhaps a greater scope adventure. Vicky and the kids were just meant to be this one-off adventure that we get attached to these characters, but they quickly finish their journey. But then out of nowhere, it's like the author's like, you know, I kind of liked writing these characters, so I think I want to keep them around. And so without any warning, any build-up, anything, just like literally something occurs that forces them out of their cozy safe zone that they had just arrived in. It happens with no build-up or warning, and within seconds, they're back on the road trying to survive the apocalypse again. There are a couple other things I do want to talk about in terms of this book. The one that kind of comes back to my point of the survival being very shallow, even if it is wide, is Vicky's alcoholism. One of the things is she's supposed to be a barely functional alcoholic, but you don't really ever feel that in the narrative. At least, you don't feel it when she would be suffering the worst. Throughout the book, she's constantly looking for alcohol, and it's only when she gets her hands on a bottle of alcohol that all of a sudden she's the severe alcoholic who can't survive without it. You don't see her suffering any ill effects when she doesn't have this alcohol on her. She doesn't get shakes real bad. She doesn't get very short and crude with the others, because she's going through withdrawal effects or anything like that. It's only when she has access to alcohol that all of a sudden she's this raging alcoholic. And it comes off as this problem only exists when I want it to exist. It doesn't feel like it's a part of the character unless the author's It's hard to put to words here. It doesn't feel like it's part of the character unless the author actively wants to talk about it in that scene. Instead, it's just, hey, she found some of those mini alcohols in a mini bar. Oh, guess she's a raging alcoholic again. You better watch her. A couple of things I did note in the early parts of the book is it felt like the author was still trying to find her tense. A couple scenes in the early parts of the book felt like they were being told in the present tense, but then all of a sudden it would switch to a past tense. And that's one of those ones where it's a little jarring because all of a sudden it'd be like, wait, this book feels weird now. Because it is subtle enough that you don't notice it until you're reading the new section, and then all of a sudden you're like, why does this feel like it's different to read, One thing I unfortunately noticed, and I've commented, for some reason this seems like really common in apocalypse books at this point. But to be fair, that's also a case of, I've mostly read terrible apocalypse books, so take that for what you will. But one of the things I'm noticing in apocalypse books is the sense of time is genuinely terrible. I don't ever get the feeling time is passing correctly. In this one, it does the same thing that others have done. Entire weeks or days will pass between sentences with no warning. It'll just be like, yeah, we're suffering now, but I think we got things down. So about 5 days later, I was sitting here cleaning stuff for Tina, and it's like, okay, so what? So I genuinely, that one bothered me a lot. Honestly, I'm not going to go through here and go through all my little nitpicks here from now on. So I'm just going to go ahead and give this book a 6 out of 10. It's kind of hard to talk about this book in depth because at the moment I'm very middle of the road on it. I liked a lot of portions of it, but I disliked an equal amount of portions of it. I loved the beginning, but I felt later on in the latter half of the book it's a drag. I like the characters, but I also think the characters are better when they're apart from each other. That when they're put together, they just make each other worse instead of better. I am invested in their struggles, and I might pick up the second book, but I don't have that much desire to seek it out. Basically, if I was about to get it, and then all of a sudden I saw, say, a sequel to Beacon 23, I'd drop this without a second thought. I would forget I ever found it. I hope that the follow-up sequels work much better, and I can earnestly say that some of the Kindle original books I have read this year involving zombies, this is by far the best. Ignore the fact that spots 2 through 5 are knockoff Last of Us series. But, yeah, this book isn't terrible. I just wasn't all that excited about it when I finished. I think the book had potential, but it didn't really feel like, again, like it didn't feel like the author was writing a zombie survival novel. It felt like the author added zombies at the last minute, and then added Theo at the last minute when she couldn't justify Vicky learning stuff. That's not fair. Theo does feel realized. It's just, I wish I'd read a story where Vicky was the main character, not a side character. I guess I should. With that being said, just remember, with every book comes an adventure, and every adventure is worth having, even the bad ones. See you later, everyone.